Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is a very first edition of the Rafana Ask the Team video blog. We're here to ask a few questions of a number of the team members at Rafana to try and help everybody who's listening in understand better what's going on with the COVID pandemic, what's going on with the work that's helping to try and fight the pandemic, and what's going on with Rafana in order to participate in that fight. My name is Mark Turchan. I am one of the lead investors at Rafana, and I have as my first guest in this very first edition, Dr. Phillip Schwartz, who is our Chief Science Officer from Rafana. Just to give you a bit of background on Phillip, and we'll get into the questions in a second. Phillip is born and raised in Chicago. He now lives in Jerusalem. He was educated on the East Coast, ultimately got his PhD in medicine at Harvard University. Very, very accomplished fellow. He's definitely a chief scientist kind of guy. He's also the president and the founder of another NASDAQ listed company called EntraBio. And we're pleased that he's a part of our team because he's helping us to design one of the better and hopefully one of the best vaccine solutions for the COVID pandemic. So Phillip, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
We have a number of questions, and we'll be using this series to continue asking a number of questions of yourself and other members of the team. And I have a whole series to ask you today, so let's get started. The very first question that we wanted to ask you, Phillip, was if you think about how you and your colleagues got started with Rafana, can you just describe what you did in the beginnings of the pandemic last year in 2020 as you started to think about how to develop this type of vaccine solution that Rafana is now working on?
Sure, Mark. Well, I'll say very early on, I was contacted by the White House Task Force on COVID in the very early stages in late February, early March. And I started thinking about the problem, about how best to approach this pandemic. Initially, I had some downtime, as most people did from the company. And we started thinking about approaches, and it became very, very clear based on what was evolving that the approaches that were being utilized were somewhat timely and sometimes politically or opportunistically motivated. But the approach that seemed most viable or most practical at that time, and initially this was purely an idealistic pursuit, was to develop a whole inactivated viral vaccine. That's the type of vaccines that's been utilized for the last 100 years, basically, or even before that, if you want to go back initially to how vaccines were developed, and is the one that's utilized for polio and smallpox and other viruses like that. Is known to work very, very well, and it's understood exactly how it works, its mechanism of action.
So as you began to develop a solution here, my understanding is that you were working fairly virtually with a number of fellow scientists in other parts of the world. Can you just describe that process? How did that play out?
Sure. Initially, we were just I was just exploring it with, at that time, my neighbor and my partner, and we were writing to the ministries of health and also to the White House Task Force and to other government agencies, and presenting to them this idea, just that they should be utilizing this idea for themselves in order to get a vaccine out the door as quickly as possible and handle the pandemic as quickly and as efficiently as possible. In order to do that, this was just obviously without any capital or anything involved. This is totally a volunteer endeavor. We contacted a number of leading scientists around the world, including Matthew Kim, who's the head of the International Vaccine Institute, formerly one of the heads of BARDA in the United States, and one of the leading virologists in the world, and other virologists of that caliber who were working on this, and also people at Harvard who I had met also, Dan Baruch, who is one of the leaders and founders of the intensive vaccine program there, and also one of the movers and shakers behind the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and a number of other people as well. And we really we were amazed that we got very, very rapid access, and we had some very interesting conversations. And almost uniformly, everyone we spoke to said that if they were approaching the problem, they would go for a whole inactivated virus as quickly as possible because they felt that was the most probable and efficient method to get a vaccine out the door as quickly as possible.
Interesting. And given that, as we know, Rafana is working on a whole inactivated virus-based solution, can you also, Philip, describe the other types of vaccine styles that are now out there, some of which are already approved? You helped me understand that early on, but I think for the viewer, it'd be helpful to kind of walk us through the 4 major types, WIV and the other 3.
Right. So, I'll just take one little step back, and that is just enunciate or elaborate on what the purpose of a vaccine is. The purpose of a vaccine is essentially to teach the immune system, which is like the defenders of our body, the army which defends our body, how to identify a foreign invader. When foreign invaders come in, whether they be bacteria or virus, et cetera, or viruses, et cetera, it's often very difficult to distinguish them from the other cells in our body because they're made from the same materials, they look very similar, so on and so forth. So the immune system has evolved over millions of years to perform that function. And essentially what you're doing is it's sort of like in an army where you show pictures to your soldiers and you say, okay, these are the uniforms that the invading soldiers are going to be wearing, or these are the helmets that they're going to be wearing, whatever that characteristic is. And so we want to show those characteristics to the immune system. That being said, the 4 different types of vaccines that are primarily being used, categories of vaccines that are being used in this pandemic, are an mRNA vaccine, which is the newest technology, a vector vaccine, like the adenovirus vector vaccine, like those from Oxford and also those from J&J, and a protein vaccine, a pure protein vaccine, which is also a relatively new entrant, but has a little bit more experience in that, and the old classical method of a WIV vaccine. So going to the mRNA vaccine, which is the newest and the least understood of those vaccines. The mRNA vaccine, basically what it does is that it goes and it takes a piece of the genetic sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, of the coronavirus, and it actually places it into a type of lipid or a type of fat that allows that RNA to be inserted into cells in the body. And in the case of the this particular mRNA, that can be theoretically any cell in the body. It's not selective to which cell it goes into. And once RNA is inside of a cell, essentially it's like an instruction. It's an instruction manual. So this little piece of the instruction manual tells the cell to create a piece of the virus. In this case, it's the spike protein for both the Pfizer and the Moderna viruses. And that piece of spike protein is then, whichever cell it's in, is displayed on the surface in order to teach the immune system how to recognize and destroy that virus. And the pluses of this is that it's a very elegant technique, is that you get something that's expressed or placed on the surface of all the biological cells or many biological cells in your body, and therefore the immune system has a lot of exposure to it and gets to see it a lot in the context of what it would look like in a cell if there was a real infection. Some of the risks is that, first of all, it's very, very unknown because there's never been a vaccine like this utilized before over the long term. The other vaccines have been used on billions of people, not millions, but billions. And therefore, they're extremely well understood and well characterized on the whole. And the second aspect of the mRNA vaccine, which is a little bit scarier, is that it also, as I mentioned, is capable of entering any cell in the body virtually. And therefore, it's not confined to a certain small number of cells. So it could theoretically go into your heart cell, into your brain cells, into your cells in your toes, theoretically. Not necessarily always does, but Those are it's not selective in terms of the cells that it causes the expression of its spike protein on their surface. So that's the mRNA vaccine. The vector vaccines, essentially what they do is they take another virus, a virus that doesn't bother people, or maybe comes from an animal and we know it's not infective or it doesn't cause any pathology or any problems in humans. So in the case of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, they chose an adenovirus that infects chimpanzees with a very mild form of something like a cold, but it doesn't even infect humans. And even the chimpanzees, it doesn't affect them. It's like you getting a very mild cold.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did was they genetically engineered that virus, and they inserted a piece again of the RNA, or in this case, the gene um, from the spike protein as well. That's the one that they focus on as well. And that goes and infects the cells that those viruses would typically affect, which is a limited population. And then those viruses can go ahead and create these proteins, which again are expressed on the cells of certain cells in the human body, and teaches the immune system how to identify it and destroy it in the future. The advantage of that system is that you get pretty good expression or pretty good representation of the foreign antigen you're looking at. But the problem is that often the immune system will start to focus on the virus or the vector that's the carrier. That's not the one that you wanted to identify as in terms of destroying and creating a very, very enhanced immune response. Because that sort of is a distraction. It's sort of like you've got like 1,000 civilians and 5 soldiers mixed into those civilians. And so now your defending army is now looking at the 1,000 civilians and saying, oh, you know what, we've got to start attacking those people as well as the 5 soldiers. It doesn't necessarily distinguish all that well.
Hmm.
So that's one of the problems with those viruses. And actually we've seen that in some of the data that's come out from them, and also from Sputnik, which is a Russian version of the same concept, where they used actually a human virus. And what they actually found, it's very interesting, is that if they do the first dose with AstraZeneca and the second dose with the Sputnik virus, that they get a much better response, because the immune system has never seen the other virus
Mm-hmm.
the first time around, and it doesn't get distracted by the viral vector in essence. That's the second type of virus. The third type of vaccine is a protein vaccine. That's best illustrated by Novavax. And what they do is they just go and express the particular protein that you're interested in teaching the immune system to recognize. In this case, it's a spike protein. And the spike is the reason that people focus on that is because it contains the receptor binding domain, the RBD. And that's the critical part of the virus that is necessary to essentially enter and infect the cell. It almost is like a lock and key. In this case, it interacts with a receptor in the cells of our body called the ACE2 receptor. In any event, that particular virus, that particular protein, when produced in large quantities and presented or given in a vaccine together with something which stimulates general immune activity, can also create some form of immunity. One of the problems with that one, the advantage for that one is very, very easy to produce on the relative scale of things. And it's also relatively quick, like the mRNA vaccine, to switch variants if necessary. But one of the main problems with these vaccines and with all of the others that focus just on the spike or just on the receptor binding domain is as that domain mutates, which is what's occurring with the South African strain, as well as with the Brazilian strain, et cetera, the virus is essentially developing a resistance to the vaccine, because no longer are they looking at the same object, looking at an object that's been modified somewhat, and so they're not quite as good at recognizing the spike protein or the receptor binding domain. And since that's the only thing that the immune system is learning to focus on, that's the only thing that they have to grab onto. And if that changes too much, then they may not be able to recognize it.
Hmm.
And finally, the whole inactivated viral approach is very, very different in the sense that what you're doing is you're taking the actual SARS-CoV-2 virus, COVID-19, growing it up in large quantities, and then killing it, inactivating it, so that it's not possible to infect people. Now, there are people out there who worry that, oh my gosh, what about if they do a poor job? Well, you can't imagine how many of these types of vaccines have been given, but it's in excess of probably 20 or 30 billion numbers of this type of vaccine in the world. That's such a massive number as possible. And in all of those instances, okay, the only time it ever led to an infection was in the very, very first batch of vaccine that they had developed, or one of the first batches, way back in the 1950s. And since that point in time, there have not been any incidents of people getting infected by a killed virus, because there are a lot of precautions and safety taken in that. So first of all, people should put that out of their mind. That's really not a risk. That vaccine, though, works in a very different way. That actually takes us in this analogy here. It takes the whole soldier, and it shows the whole soldier who's invading to the defending army, to the immune system. And that whole soldier has many characteristics, including the receptor binding domain and many other things that are also important for the virus's operation. And the advantage of this is that even if the receptor binding domain mutates, you still have tremendous recognition of all of the other domains, all of the other areas of the virus. The other major advantage of this is it's a very, very simple, straightforward technique that's been utilized for decades. And you don't have to guess at what the most important thing is to recognize, because you're presenting the whole virus. The third aspect of it that makes it very, very simple and advantageous also is that you can go ahead and produce this, and you know that it's because it's been utilized in billions of people and you're just putting in a killed virus, that it's going to be essentially so presented or shown to the immune system in the appropriate fashion. So all of those things are very, very interesting and conservative and safe advantages of the system. And that's why, without going and doing a tremendous amount of research, just from a very idealistic approach, this is the approach that actually many viral experts in the world in the beginning of the pandemic said, you had to choose which strategy to develop a vaccine, which one would you do? Almost universally, they always said a whole inactivated viral vaccine if they didn't have a conflict of interest.
It's interesting that you're saying that about the whole inactivated viral approach. And yet, as you look at the worldwide activities going on, it seems like the Chinese and the Indians believed that and they followed up with it, and Rifan is following up with it, but a lot of other parts of the world, here in the States, in Europe, etc., decided to go with some of the other approaches. What's your thought on that?
Right. So I think there are a number of drivers. I don't think, first of all, I want to say that I don't think the vast majority of this is driven by greed or corruption. So I don't want to play it out as if there's like the evil empire out there that's trying to go ahead and make a tremendous amount of money. Although the reality is that they have made a tremendous amount of money and they will continue to do so. Because of their rapid response and ability to get these vaccines out the door as quickly as possible. So the WIV vaccine, there are a few different reasons why they were not developed. One is a sort of a political one. There are no WIV vaccine manufacturers in the West, pretty much in the U.S. or in the rest of the Western world. Primarily, all of that capacity, so to speak, even though it's a low-level technology, has migrated to India. And so therefore, when President Trump was looking at these, he was looking for a homegrown US only. And so it would have taken longer a period of time for them to go ahead and develop the capacity, or they would have had to partner with an Indian company for that capacity, although that capacity exists and is available. The second aspect of it is that this is more on the political realm, is that they really wanted, I mean, there was a tremendous amount of motivation from those companies who had been developing these new, like the mRNA vaccines, these new technologies, to get these out there, because not only would it validate their technology and help, as we see, help treat the world, but then for the next generation and all different other types of pandemics and viruses, so on and so forth, they would have had validated this. And the truth is that in a normal regulatory environment, it probably would have taken them another few years at least to get these approved. And so therefore, there was a tremendous motivation from that perspective to get these approved as quickly as possible. And there were really a whole bunch of easings or making it more, making it less difficult for them to go through the regulatory process, even though they didn't have all of the data that people usually have. And then the third aspect of it was, in terms of them not going for a WIV, is that they really wanted to have something that they could call their own, whether it be the U.S. or other countries of the world, the UK, etc. So those, I think, were the primary motivations for not going after a WIV.
It's interesting, literally at about the point of the anniversary of the pandemic declaration this week. And we're at a point now where we have almost 120 million confirmed cases around the world, about a little more than 2.5 million deaths around the world, lots of vaccines already starting to be delivered around the world. And yet there seems to be a real focus of orders of these vaccines in the first world countries and a lot less in the third world countries. I know Rafana has talked a lot about the ability to build solutions that would be willing to, or be able to focus in on the 4 to 5 billion people that don't really have any visible access to any kind of vaccine solution. What's your sense on the, call it, state of the union as it relates to this pandemic, as we see these variants you talked about previously starting to emerge? And how do you see all of this evolving over the next, say, year, 2 years, 3 years, that sort of thing?
Right. So first of all, I want everyone who's listening in to get a very, very clear understanding. Curing and defending the first world or the Western world from this pandemic or the virus will be very, very short-lived, because what happens with all of the pandemics that we've seen in the past is that as long as there is a reservoir of virus in another place on Earth, that reservoir will continue to mutate, evolve, develop new variants, and will come back to bite you later on. So just going ahead and trying to have Fortress, Europe and Fortress US is not a good strategy. And therefore, it's very important for people to understand that it's not just an altruistic, idealistic pursuit to vaccinate the whole world, but it's actually very, very important for dealing with the pandemic. So I want to put that out there right away. And the second part is that I think as we're seeing already, and as we see in the media, so on and so forth, this virus is obviously mutating in ways that are different than people expected. And actually, the mutations are more significant than people expected, I have to say, from a virology perspective. And therefore, a lot of the vaccines that were developed, were all developed based on the original strain, what's called the Wuhan strain or the Washington strain. There are many different names for it. They're very, very similar. Many of the vaccines are having reduced responses or reduced efficacy against the new variants. And so therefore, I see that people will have to go ahead and get boosters or get new vaccines in order to properly protect themselves. In addition to that, virtually, I think it's probably 90% of the world's population, or perhaps a little bit less, perhaps 75% of the world's population is not going to be able to have access to most of these vaccines, in particular the mRNA vaccines. Obviously, distribution and logistics of those vaccines is virtually impossible in many, many different countries, even countries which are somewhat developed. And that's very, very difficult to do. And so therefore, until we have a relatively stable, inexpensive vaccine to distribute around the world, this will continue to be a problem. If people continue to charge high prices for the vaccines also, it's not going to be accessible, and the pandemic will just come back to the West, where everyone has been vaccinated with expensive vaccines, but those vaccines, eventually the virus will develop mutations which will allow it to infect the West again.
So, Philip, do you see this situation? It's kind of back to your soldier analogy, in the sense that, a few battles might be won, but the war might not around the world. And there's talk in the last few weeks, as we get to this anniversary on the pandemic, that suggests that we might get to a fourth wave of uptick in the number of cases and hospitalizations and deaths, et cetera, around the world. How do you see this playing out with all these new variants starting to migrate, if you will, to other parts of the world from their original locations?
First, I have to say I don't know, so no one should think. I mean, my best guess would be is that you will have, quote unquote, a fourth wave. It may be that the vaccines will sort of mitigate a little bit of the fourth wave, but I think that the fourth wave will be more severe in some ways to the first and second waves, at least, in the sense also that not only will people be getting the virus, but these variants, many of them also have more morbidity. In other words, they have worse effects on people. It's not just that they are capable of overcoming the defense systems, but they also can have, like now, I know that we're seeing in Israel that the young people who get infected, who previously would very, very rarely get hospitalized, are now starting to be hospitalized. And that's a very, very scary thing, and it's clearly occurring with the new variants. So very careful.
Really appreciate it, and this is to be continued. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.